1 year ago today, a mob of mostly white men stormed the Capitol to try to keep their race baiting idol in power. The attack was not the grand finale of white supremacy or Trumpism, but it was a national coming out party for the political right insurrectionist movement, whose roots were set decades ago and completely visible in electoral politics and public battles as early as the 1990s. A new report out shows that the majority of the insurrectionists were not extremists, but mainstream white folks. How do we heal a nation when the guy or woman living next door to you may be the ringleader in destroying our democracy? Experts weigh in. All coming up next.
Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report with Areva Martin.
A recent University of Chicago report found that more than 700 of the insurrectionists who were criminally charged in the attack against our Capitol on January 6th a year ago were not members of some extreme political fringe. Nearly 90% were regular people. They weren't Proud Boys or Oath Keepers. They were from the mainstream. 7%, only 7% were unemployed. But half of the insurrectionists were business owners or white-collar workers, including doctors, lawyers, and accountants. This same University of Chicago report found that the key driver of this movement, this white supremacist movement, is the theory of the Great Replacement. This theory dates back to the early 1990s. So although the movement isn't new, what is startling to some experts is how pervasive this ideology has become and how those that buy into it also are willing to employ and utilize violence. The report warns that given that 21 million Americans have bought into the Trump lie that Biden is an illegitimate president and have accepted violence as a form of responding to this lie, the report says we should brace for more violence, particularly with the upcoming election and as Trump launches his second bid, well, it's not really his second, but his multiple bids to become president of the United States again. This is really pretty sobering. And as we heard President Biden this morning say in his speech, as he acknowledged January 6th, the year anniversary, he said, we are in the battle for the soul of our nation. Here for our leadoff panel are Dr. Niambi Carter. She's a professor of political science at Howard University. She's the author of American While Black, African Americans, Immigration, and the Limits of Citizenship. Also joining her is Professor Alex Keyssar. He is a professor of history and social policy at Harvard University and the author of multiple books, including his latest, Why Do We Still Have the Electoral College? Good morning, Professor Carter and Professor Keyssar. I wanted to start by asking both of you, are you familiar with this University of Chicago report? I was pretty shocked when I read the report, read the articles about the report, and this concept that, we've been, I think, buying into, which is that the insurrectionists were these horrible people. They were all parts of this fringe movement. And this report says no, that the majority of the people that have been criminally charged are like, your next door neighbor. They're your classic lawyer, doctor, accountant, business owner, white collar worker. Had you seen the report, Dr. Carter?
I've seen bits and pieces of it, but I think what it highlights, Areva, and Happy New Year and good morning to you, is that we have bought into this notion that extremism only happens with these fringe elements. I mean, when we think about the KKK, for example, most white Americans weren't members of the Ku Klux Klan, but you don't have to be. You just have to have an ecosystem that supports these groups being there. And so when we talk about the Proud Boys or the Boogaloo Boys or these different organizations, that makes people feel more comfortable. That makes people feel better because it's like those people over there. And unfortunately, we have bought into this lie, whether we were talking about who voted for Donald Trump in 2016 or who was at the insurrection. that it was poor people or that it was undereducated people or that it was, these kinds of marginalized communities. But when you really think about it, who had the money to come to the Capitol? Who had the money to pay for a hotel to stay? Who had the money to build the signs and show up that day downtown? It's never going to be who you think it is. But we like telling ourselves that story because it makes it feel like it's less dangerous or that it's less pervasive than it actually is. And I think what this report highlights is this is a much larger movement of people than most of us suspect.
And that's an excellent point, because we do know some of the people that were there actually flew there on private jets. So not only did they have money for a plane ticket, they had the kind of money that allowed them to either own, lease, or somehow have access to private jets. So again, though, I think when you see it in black and white, and you're right, Dr. Carter, it is easier to think about them being the other. The bad people, the boogeyman, the dark people versus, thinking about them as potentially your neighbors. Dr. Keyssar, help us understand this whole notion of this replacement theory. What is this ideology? And some say it took root in California in the 1990s. What's your research show about replacement theory?
Well, replacement theory, which actually has some roots in Europe, actually was being advanced in France among other places. I mean, it's a theory. It's got different variants, but basically, it's a theory that the traditional white, often Protestant, but not necessarily Protestant people, in this country are being gradually replaced by Black and brown and immigrant and Jewish and others who are being brought into the country. And the notion is that it's an intentional effort. It's not just that this is social change going on. The idea of replacement theory is that this is being done. And this is being done consciously to us. And a big part of the theory, or of many variants of the theory, is that it is Jewish people who are engineering this by importing Black and brown people. You may remember at Charlottesville, the chant was, "The Jews will not replace us." That was a chant version of replacement theory. It's paranoid. And it's dangerous.
Do you think it was a part of the driving force of the people that showed up at the Capitol a year ago?
I think that the people who showed up at the Capitol were driven by whether explicit replacement theories. Certainly, they were driven by the notion that or the fear that this country will become a majority minority country at some point in the prolonged future, and that they, as middle or working class white people, were losing power. Let me add one more note here in response to your previous question, which is that I think that I do know the Chicago study, and I taught a class last spring on what happened on January 6th. And one of the things we set out to do was to say who was they, who were these people, right? We know about the guy with the antlers, but who were these people? And the results, came out looking quite like this study, which is that it was folks small around. It was your neighbors, but there also were some highly organized groups like the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers who played a special role in the dynamics of it. You may remember the scene of, I think it was the Proud Boys, as a crowd was gathered on the steps of the Capitol. The Proud Boys, all dressed alike and carrying quasi weapons, marched through the crowd and went up to the door and smashed it in. Right. It's like you need a sea to swim in, but you need a vanguard to smash the door. And I think we have both.
It's an interesting question, Dr. Carter. So Dr. Keyssar says, yes, it's everyday people that were there, but there was this organized group, these extremists. It's kind of, I guess, puzzling to me that your everyday accountant goes to work and, crunches numbers, or your lawyer that tries cases in courtrooms across the country are going to affiliate or align themselves or be driven by or led by these kinds of extremists. I mean, typically these groups are not mixing. This isn't your typical, groups that you think of as working in any kind of collaborative way. So what's happening in our country that is causing the most unlikely groups of people to find themselves coming together around what must be their common purpose?
Well, I mean, we can think of it as strange bedfellows, right? That's one way to think of it. Certainly, these wouldn't be people who may have them over for dinner, but it is also the case that they're saying things that people believe. It's like, I may not want to be an oath keeper, but they say things that I believe in, or they give me the courage and the confidence, right, to move in this particular kind of way. I also think, look, we cannot overlook the power of white supremacy to unite all kinds of white people of different stripes in this idea that whiteness has to be protected, right? And that whiteness has to be kept, the boundaries of whiteness have to be kept sacrosanct. And one of the ways to do that is political power. And the idea that, Native people and Black people and Latino people from Georgia and Arizona and all these places really changed the balance of power in this country, for many seem antithetical to the notion of Americanness and citizen and who gets to be those things and who gets to sort of claim the mantle of those things. And so I think, if we're really being honest here, this is not that strange, right? I mean, if we look, not even that long ago, when we look at the Emmett Till case, for example, which, again, you have Milam and Bryant who murdered this boy, but you have regular workaday white folks in that same community say they're not guilty, but they knew they were guilty. But it was just the idea of sending these two white men to prison for murdering this Black boy at a time when sort of white supremacy was the chief sort of concern, right, to preserve itself. And so I think we cannot sort of absolve these people because they wouldn't normally commiserate with one another from their investment in white supremacy and notions of white supremacy that seem to be under attack and that seem to be becoming increasingly unpopular as the country changes into a majority minority country through time. And we've already seen it in certain states that have become majority minority, like Hawaii and others. So I think the idea that there are certain kinds of people who do this and others who don't may be a bit overblown. There's certainly, to Dr. Keyssar's point, people who are going to be at the forefront of this, but there are lots of people who help and support and buoy them along the way, and people who probably never thought of themselves as extremists, but here we are.
So, Dr. Keyssar, if that is in fact the case, and if these everyday people are drawn to something, if they align with, the thoughts, the beliefs, the ideologies of some of these extremists, how do we win this battle? President Biden this morning in his speech said we're in a battle for the soul of this nation. We have, folks on Fox News and other conservative channels, commentators, anchors like Tucker Carlson, who are promoting these racist and anti-Semitic views, and they have millions and millions of viewers. So how do we ever win this battle if we seem to be outnumbered, at least in terms of the rhetoric?
If believe me, if I had a clear and certain answer to that question, I wouldn't keep it private. I would be the first to spread it around. I think, my impression, and I've done some work on this, is that let me start with what doesn't work. I don't think that rational arguments be put forward by people like us or Senate committees is going to do it. I mean, I believe in those rational arguments, and but I don't think that any evidence we put forward that Donald Trump did not win the 2020 election is going to change the minds of the 70% of Republicans who think that he did, and then everything else that follows. I think that a lot of this has to do with people's feelings and emotions and anxieties and fears. And if the climate of anxiety and fear can be lessened somewhat, and if we who are on the other side of the, of this politically, and in terms of notions of racial equality and equality more generally. I think that we have to work to develop one-on-one relationships and talk to people and listen to them and talk to people. And that, that's not easy. I don't have a script that I can distribute to say, here's how to do it. But I think that's our best chance. If we, try to figure out ways to have those conversations, get to know people one-on-one.
Yeah, some of that conversation, Dr. Carter, has to center around this whole notion of violence. There's this poll out that says 1/3 of people believe that violence is okay. And we know that that number is probably even higher amongst, certain conservatives. So how are you having conversations with folks who are saying they're willing to use violence, or they're willing to, use guns and knives and bats and anything else to preserve the lie? Kind of hard conversation.
Yeah, and I don't know that this is anything we can talk ourselves out of, in part because people are not swayed by the rational argument. Like, they don't want evidence. What they want is someone to make them feel good about the way that they feel, right? They want someone to confirm that this paranoia, that this sense that they are being pushed out is real. And so they don't listen to anything other than people who confirm those ideas. So I think the conversation is going to be probably low on the things to do, especially because every message that they do get about change in this country is about violence. They all go back to the American Revolution or the Boston Tea Party. All these events that happened, the Civil War that changed our country, are all around violence, right? And you have, members of Congress who have to go through metal detectors to go do their jobs now because other members want to bring guns into the chamber and all of this. It's sort of like, why wouldn't people get the message that violence is the way to solve your problems in America? Because America is a violent country. We are steeped in violence. We are steeped in guns and our protection of those things. So I get why people think that violence is the way. But if you also have media outlets, public officials and other kinds of elites telling people and feeding people a steady diet of lies, feeding people this paranoia, telling people don't trust the institutions where they actually hold positions, then we're going to continue to see this. And I don't know that there's a way to get around this other than all of us having to be honest about what happened. And we have to care more about the public good than about our political power and our political wins. And I don't see that rolling off. I think elites really have a lot to do here. I really think you're going to take these members of Congress and these governors and these state lawmakers and these mayors and these local officials to really sort of cut the crap and tell people the hard thing, which is Donald Trump lied to you. The election was not stolen. And what you do is not, foment an insurrection. You come back the next time and try to win. Yeah. That's what you do. And I don't know that that's going to happen anytime soon.
So Dr. Keyssar, Dr. Carter said you be honest, about what happened. Both of you are professors, you're historians. How is the history of January 6th going to be written? Because we're already seeing the rewriting of it in real time by Republicans who are downplaying it, who are recharacterizing the violence that we all witnessed with our own eyes. So what are students in your class, or a class like yours, who are going to read about this even 10 years from now? What are they going to read?
Well, I think that students in courses that focus on this will be reading a history that that probably is pretty close to your views and in our views now, which is to see this as an insurrection, as an attempt to illegitimately keep Trump in power, as a part of a strategy that was both violent and quasi-legal and strategic. I think that is the way it will be seen, but there will be a counter narrative. There already is a counter narrative, a kind of revisionist, already revisionist history before a lot of the history has been written. It will likely not be done by professional historians and political scientists, because we do have, we have biases, but we also have some evidentiary requirements, and there will be this alternative version, which I think will see the people at the Capitol on January 6th, a year ago today, as angry patriots who were defending the Constitution, and who are enraged because an election had been stolen from them. And then, from which many other, events happen. So there, what the danger there, I mean, or what makes me very unhappy about this is that we're going to end up with a society that has two different narratives that are not reconcilable. One will be believed by a majority of the population, another by a minority, but a large minority. And that's going to make pulling things together pretty difficult.
Yeah. Dr. Carter, last question for you is about race. There's going to be a lot of debate about the role of racism, nationalism in this, this insurrection. Many folks, as we know, don't believe race or slavery played a part in the Civil War. They've rewritten race and slavery out of the Civil War. How will race play into the narrative that will be written about January 6th?
I'm glad you mentioned this, Areva, because I think part of the thing that I always want people to remember as a district resident is that there are over 600,000 people that live in that city, and a majority of them are Black, right? So the people that were in those buildings cleaning up that mess, the people who had to be forced to live in a lockdown for that evening because of those events, the people who had to live in neighborhoods where these people were doing Airbnbs, right, are residents of the city and largely overlooked. And I think one of the things that happens repeatedly where stuff like January 6th happens is it happens in the district, a majority Black city with a Black mayor that has no power to call out the National Guard when they need it, who had to use their local police to try to shore up federal law enforcement, that almost gets no mention in any of this. In addition to the fact that many of the people who showed up on January 6th were inspired by notions of the United States as an all-white country that is theirs to do what they will with. And they can just sort of exclude the votes of Black people and brown people and indigenous people in this country. I think you cannot get around it. I think people would like to deny it, but white supremacy is not about just thinking white people are great. It's thinking that certain kinds of white people are great to the detriment of everyone else, right? And the belief that everyone else has no right to question that authority and that supremacy. And we see it playing out in states across this country with voting rights laws and prohibitions. And so I think you saw it sort of culminate in January 6th, but there's no getting around it. But I will also say we might have to be patient, because when we look at this historical question, look how long it took us to tell the story of Wilmington, North Carolina, 1898, right? Now, look how long it took us to tell the story of Tulsa and the Tulsa race riots correctly. Look how long it took us to tell the story of the Civil War, even though there are counter narratives, more completely. Same with enslavement. History is an iterative process. So January 6th will be talked about for a very long time. But again, race has to be central, if not just thinking about the city, thinking about the impetus for that moment.
Thank you so much, Dr. Carter, for bringing, light to that, the demographics of Washington, D.C. and the reality of what that community lived through on that day. Because you're right, no one talks about it. No one talks about the how that community or that 600,000 people are disenfranchised in terms of not having a vote. But yet they are the people that live in that community and, felt probably most directly, other than the congressmen and women who were inside that Capitol. They're the ones who felt the brunt of it. Definitely need to talk about that more. Thank you so much, Dr. Carter. Thank you, Dr. Keyssar, for your insights on this. Clearly, we're going to be talking about this for a long time. It'll be very interesting to see how that history is written and the role of race and racism in the story that's told about January 6th. Really appreciate your insights this morning.
Thank you.
All right, another big part of the story of January 6th is who has been prosecuted, who's going to jail, and who is not. My next guest wrote a recent op-ed in Politico cautioning us about getting excited about, possibly seeing Donald Trump in an orange jumpsuit anytime soon. He's the legal affairs columnist for Politico magazine. He's a former federal prosecutor and host of the On Topic podcast. He's a returning guest to the special report. He is Renato Mariatti. Good morning, Renato, and thank you so much for joining us this morning. I know you wrote this really interesting piece in the Politico, dash any expectations that folks may have had that Donald Trump might be prosecuted and going to jail. Help us understand why that's more unlikely than likely. I think you're on mute,
I'm
Renato.
sorry. It's something that I know that a lot of people are interested in or looking forward to, and I can understand why. I mean, the average person looking at this, there's folks attacking our Capitol. Trump was whipping them up. They had flags with his name on it. So why is he not responsible? He clearly was, cheering him on. We hear reports that he's watching television. And I think what everyone needs to remember is the criminal laws in this country, don't hold people responsible merely because they're cheering somebody on who is committing a crime. And so the real question, whether or not Trump is guilty of, let's say, obstructing Congress, which is what many of these folks are charged with, depends on whether or not he actively aided what they were doing once he knew what was going on. In other words, not just that he was happy about it and he felt honored and excited that people were attacking the Capitol, but rather, did he take some concrete step to help them? That's what aiding and abetting is. Or was this part of some scheme or plan that he had and he took a part of, which would be conspiracy? And I'm not saying he didn't. I don't know one way or the other, but what I do know is there is no publicly available evidence I've seen that is enough to prove this beyond a reasonable doubt.
Well, Renato, great legal analysis, and I know oftentimes the court of public opinion, thinks one way about incidents and events, but yet there is the reality of a courtroom and very different worlds. And as a lawyer, of course, I got to remind myself of that because I'm too was getting excited about this. But what about the speech? You don't think the speech that he gave before the insurrectionists marched to the Capitol, could that be enough in and of itself for this obstruction of Congress type charge?
I don't think so, because his argument would be, I think it would be a very difficult case to try, Areva. As somebody who is a lawyer yourself, think about what the defense is going to say here. That speech was all over the place. Trump is a word salad all the time of just all sorts of words. He talks at times about being peaceful there. It's sort of you can find whatever you want to find in that speech. And so, what his lawyers are going to say is, of course, he could never have contemplated that these people were going to attack the Capitol and hurt police officers. The president of the United States would never support that. And he later condemned them. Now, I understand his tweet was begrudging and not enough. But I think that there'll be enough there that it would create an issue for prosecutors. And of course, there's a First Amendment defense, because we know that the Supreme Court has has put a pretty high bar on charging people for their words. And so, I do think that this may meet that very high bar that's rarely met, because there was imminent lawless action, that was incited. But I think that there are certainly arguments that defense lawyer would make, and I can understand why a prosecutor would be reluctant to take that case on.
So tell me, we heard Merrick Garland, U.S. Attorney General, who was under tremendous pressure from Democrats and even some Republicans to speak out, to give the nation more information about what his office is doing in terms of not just arresting and charging the people that were there, but looking at, congressional members and White House officials who might have been involved in the planning. Everybody wants the big fish. It's like, fine, you got the guy that broke out the window, but what about the mastermind behind the insurrection? What is the evidence? Having been a federal prosecutor yourself, knowing what that federal process is like with, investigation before you get to the decision to charge, what is the evidence you think Merrick Garland's team would have to find before they would consider charging Trump?
I think that they would want to know what communications, like they would need communications by Trump that reveals his state of mind. So just to make crystal clear, the challenge whenever you're prosecuting a case like this is, what did the person intend? What did they know? Trump notoriously doesn't really use emails, texts much. He doesn't write a lot down, which makes things harder for prosecutors. And so they need the testimony of people who were talking to him that day about what he said. They need evidence. We've seen, for example, some of these PowerPoints with fantastical ideas of seizing the ballot boxes and declaring states of emergency. They could, prosecutors could really use a PowerPoint that reflects what actually happened, not like seizing all the ballots and declaring states of emergency. and all of that, but actually, there's an insurrection. Let's not contact the National Guard. Let's do this and that. Things that make what Trump did or didn't do look more like part of a scheme, a thought out scheme or plan, rather than just him reacting to what he saw on television, or more aptly, not reacting, not doing anything when he saw this unfolding on television.
So what about some of these congressional members? We know there were allegations that Boebert and some others were giving tours of the Capitol, maybe like helping these insurrectionists case out where they should go and, know where certain members had their offices. Do you think there's going to be enough there to charge some of the congressional members if there isn't, the there for Trump?
They're a lot closer to the action, right? Because they're actually communicating with and meeting with people who were attacking the Capitol, okay, who are like hands-on in that activity. So for sure, I think that if they had, the question that is going to be, that the key question there is, did they have knowledge that this was going to happen or some reason to believe that this happened? In other words, Boebert and any of the other members of Congress are going to say, well, of course I give tours. These are constituents or these are supporters. Of course, when a citizen comes and they want to see the Capitol, we give them a tour. And what prosecutors are going to want to look for evidence of is, were they giving information that you wouldn't ordinarily give to citizens? Information, like you said, where to enter, helping them case out certain entranceways, knowing where security officers are and where certain members are at. And then secondly, was there any indication given by these folks when they were meeting with these members about what was going to come next? And I think that's what you would need to prove this beyond a reasonable doubt. And the standard I know is high, but I think we want to make sure that we keep our eye on the ball regarding that standard, because you don't want these prosecutions to fail. I think that would just lend credence to these, truther types, conspiracy theorists.
What do you make of all the text messages? They seem kind of salacious. You got Jim Jordan involved. You've got everybody blowing up Mark Meadows' cell phone, from Fox News host to his own children, begging Trump to do something, say something. Does that show any, potential connection, or at least belief on their parts that their father had, or Trump, the president, had more control, that he perhaps had the ability to end something? Because if you didn't start it, what authority would he have over these people other than just the bully pulpit as the president?
Yeah, I certainly think it proves beyond a reasonable doubt that many of these people are hypocrites. It proves beyond a reasonable doubt that I agree with you, Areva, that they believe that Trump had control over these folks. And I think, it's interesting to see the right try to twist themselves in knots and, almost like pretzels, trying to avoid the fact that these people who literally are carrying flags with Trump's name on it were not Trump. They were Trump supporters, okay? And they were following what they believed the president's wishes were at the time. And if Trump came out and said, no, that's not what I want you to do, go home, you must end this attack immediately, it would have potentially had some impact here. And that's apparent. I think the issue is, that itself is not enough, right? In other words, if there is a riot going on in the city, we usually don't hold the mayor, the governor, whoever responsible for the riot. Now, and what if you say, well, these are supporters of that political party, that's a supporter of that politician? That usually not enough to hold them responsible, criminally responsible for that crime. And so I think that's the bar. That's why I wrote the piece, is because I feel like there's a lot of vitriol towards Merrick Garland. And I'm not sure that all of that is justified.
Yeah, I think one of the Democratic former senators said, what he does with respect to this prosecution is going to determine, his legacy as U.S. Attorney General. I guess there's just no getting around the reality is that Trump was in proximity to these rioters in ways that are different than what you just described. Like, there's a riot in the city and the mayor doesn't, say something soon enough, we're not going to hold that mayor criminally liable. But in that case, you don't have the mayor having spent years engaged in some level with the rioters, and then right before the incident occurred, having really riled up the rioters. I think that is what's so difficult for people to understand, is how Trump will escape any kind of criminal liability when, he's tweeting, come to DC, there's something going to happen. Folks in his orbit are tweeting these, messages about something happening. Do you think a more aggressive, and I'm not going to bash Merrick Garland. He has a difficult time. I'm not crazy about him, but God knows he's better than anybody we had under Trump. But do you think a more aggressive prosecutor would say, maybe I'm going to take my chances. There's enough here. There's not the slam dunk piece of evidence that prosecutors normally want when they go to trial, but there's enough circumstantial evidence here that I'm going to go for it.
Yeah, it's interesting. Maybe you may have that kind of, you may have something like that. I will say that you might have that in a different case. I think incitement, actually, I could see a DC Attorney General bringing an incitement case. I know that he was looking at that. I don't know what ever came of that. There hasn't, of course, been anything brought. I wonder, because he may have seen the potential pitfalls. I will just say, Areva, part of the problem here is that there's not enough of a conversation about the limitations in our own laws. I mean, there hasn't been a lot of discussion about how we need to change the law to make sure that this doesn't happen again, because I think all the public assumes that the laws we have are good enough. I mean, you know as well as I do that tweeting about things rarely going to create any liability because it's First Amendment protected speech. Giving talks and speeches to supporters, even sharply worded ones, rarely going to get you in trouble because of the First Amendment. And so it's really, I think, a fairly difficult road to hoe. I do think there would be some people who push forward anyway, but I just don't know if they would regret it. I mean, one of the last times I was on your program, we were talking about the Rittenhouse case. And I do think that was a case where Wisconsin prosecutors, local prosecutors, may have overcharged that case, charged it charged over the evidence that they had, because they understandably saw an evil in front of them and they wanted to do something about it. And I applaud the effort to bring him to justice, but I don't think that case was as carefully brought and put together as it could have been. And I think there's something to be said for seeing this evidence play out, because I will also say, Areva, you and I both know that the criminal law process is all in secret. And I'm not really sure that the public would be well served to have those text messages and PowerPoints that we talked about earlier be secret grand jury records, that materials that no one could see or have access to, while the Justice Department debates a very difficult criminal prosecution.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up in terms of conversations about changing the law, because my next guest is going to talk about the fact that none of the people actually at the Capitol have been charged with domestic terrorism, because we don't have domestic terrorism laws on the books. And so the charges that have been leveled against them have resulted in pretty low level fines and penalties and jail time, which again is appalling to us that watch this violence play out on our, with our very eyes on television. So yeah, I do think we need to talk about, we're in a different era where it's not, those other people, somewhere, foreign to this country who are a threat to our democracy, and how do we hold them accountable? And my earlier guest just said, talking to them rationally is not going to work because they're not, prone to listening to rational arguments. But we do have this process, a criminal justice system that does hold people accountable for their bad acts. And the question is, is our criminal justice system up to speed to deal with the types of conduct and activities, that this embrace of violence, this violent language, rhetoric, and then the actual execution of violence that we saw on January 6th. So really thoughtful conversation, Renato. Thank you so much for your insights. Sobering, but so much of this, year anniversary is just that, very sobering. But keep writing those insightful pieces in Politico. We'll keep following you, and thank you for joining me again this morning.
Thank you.
All right. Earlier in the week, as I talked about, my next guest talking about domestic terrorism, we don't talk about it nearly enough because we like to think that terrorism, happens with some bad folks that aren't in our midst. They aren't our next door neighbors. But as we've been talking about all morning, that's not true. So earlier in this week, I sat down with Dr. Areva Martin. He is a professor at the University of Massachusetts Lowell, and he's one of the nation's leading experts on far-right extremists and the violence that they perpetrate. He's also the author of the book, American Zealots, Inside Right-Wing Domestic Terrorism. Take a look at the interview I did with Professor Perliger. Welcome, Professor Perliger, and thank you so much for joining me this morning.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. First, I just want to say Happy New Year to you and hope you had really good holidays. Kind of unbelievable that here we are at January 2022. And as you know, today is the one-year anniversary of that vicious attack on our nation's capital, January 6th of 2021. I want to ask you about this recent New York Times op-ed piece that said that event, that January 6th event, is not in the past, and that January 6th is an existential threat every day in state houses around this country. Do you agree with that assessment by the New York Times?
I agree with the overall message. I don't think that January 6th necessarily is the threat. I think the threat is that the ideology that is responsible for what we've seen on January 6th is still living, is still proliferating, is still gaining a lot of support. And those organizations and movements that promoted the ideology that led to January 6th are still very active, are still very effective, and they are able to mobilize a lot of support and also very effectively delegitimize our democratic institutions, democratic processes, and so on. So yes, so the ideology is still there. And I also agree with the fact that the threat is really much more regional than focusing on Washington, D.C. I think that when we're thinking about the threat, we need to think about many of those organizations, associations all over the country who feel frustrated, angry, raged, and are encouraged to act, and it makes it very likely that some of them at least will try to attack local politicians, local institutions, local organizations. So definitely the threat is still out there.
Do you think the ideology that you just described, Professor, is that more pervasive today than it was even a year ago in January? So you says it's growing. So yes. I just query is, are they even stronger? Those that hold that ideology, are they even stronger today than they were a year ago?
Yes, and I think we see that in other areas, in other policy areas. So, for example, this sense of hostility, animosity towards the central government, towards the federal government, the delegitimacy of policymakers. We see that also when we're looking at the growing overlap between anti-vaxxers and some of the far-right groups. We see that in the overlap between those who promoted the ideology of January 6th and those who promote ideology that demand that people will ignore public health mandates or policies. We see a growing overlap between different ideological groups, and all of them, what they have in common is this strong animosity, lack of trust in the government, in democratic institutions. So they actually threatening each other, and they further able to mobilize more support by really exploiting people's fear, people lack of access to actual reliable information and data. And this kind of movement that see the federal government as some kind of an evil, intrusive entity is something that we see growing and expanding all over the country.
Yeah, one of the things that we are learning because of the congressional committee that's been investigating the attack over the last year is that there was a lot of planning and a lot of preparation leading up to January 6th. What were you hearing, given your proximity to these groups in terms of being a researcher? What were you hearing leading up to January 6th of 2021?
So, already before January 6th and during January 6th itself, me and some other colleagues actually tweeted in real time that there's nothing really surprising with what happened. If you listen to the rhetoric that was used by leaders of organizations such as the 3%ers, the Oath Keepers, the Proud Boys, they were very clear about their intention to act in order to prevent the certification of the election results. They were very clear about their willingness to use violence and to use resistance, and by their willingness to really act against our political institutions. So there was nothing really surprising here. We also knew in advance that these organizations have the skills, they have the capabilities, they have a significant portion of their members are former military, former law enforcement, hence they have a lot of experience in organizing these kind of operations, in prepping for these kind of operations, in collecting intelligence. When you look at the communications between members of the organizations during the insurrection, you see how they really coordinated their efforts, sending messages and instructions to one another, how they should proceed, how they should act, how they should control the protesters, and so on. So there was really nothing surprising here. And in real time, I actually tweeted, and anyone can go to my Twitter feed and see how basically while this was happening, I was tweeting that this is a colossal security failure because all the signs were there. We just had to listen.
And so one of the big questions that the committee has been asking is, were these groups, this well-organized activity that you just described, was it in coordination with members of Congress and then with the then President Donald Trump? Has your research led you to that conclusion, that this was coordinated with certain Republican Congress people as well as the president?
So I think there's a guilt of omission. None of them actually engage in a real effort to dismiss some of the most destructive conspiracy theories that were basically running amok among those groups. Also, the rhetoric, the language that was utilized in order to delegitimize the elections, the results, naturally was perceived by these organizations as a signal to act, as a signal basically to do something about that. And there's no other way around it. When you are delegitimizing the democratic process, basically what you're saying to people, you cannot trust the government, you cannot trust democracy. And if there's no trust in democracy, there's no reason to accept the results of the democratic process. So all those members of Congress who stayed silent before and after, and eventually tried to mitigate the impact of January 6th, they have responsibility, and they are responsible to what happened, because eventually many of those individuals who showed up in January 6th were responding to signals that they got from their leaders, from politicians, from the leaders of the Republican Party, that's basically said, yes, there was something unacceptable that was done, the elections were stolen, and you need to act. And if you look at the rhetoric and the language, that's what happened.
I'm asking about more active participation. So we know there was acts of omission. We know there was cold language. We know there was, innuendos. But what about active participation? Has your research shown that there was actually, active, involved, engaged, real-time participation by folks we've elected to office?
I think that there were some of the communications showed that there were some members who felt that this is not the worst thing that is happening, that people have the ability to show their anger. Actual, basically, planning an organization by members of Congress, that's not something that I was able to detect. Definitely, there were some of them who felt that it's great that there's such a mess, that there's such a chaos, that shows that what power that we have, but not really. And I think that, if I may add, I think that January 6th was really one event. I think it's really important to look at the overall trend, and the overall trend is very clear. Our data showed that in the last 2 years, we had hundreds increase in hate crimes and far-right violence. And what is really concerning is that the violence is not really just focusing on the political leaders. We see dramatic increase in violence against Asian Americans, for example. I'm talking about 100%. We see dramatic increase in anti-Semitic attacks. We see dramatic increase in violence against different minorities. So this kind of environment that these groups create encourage many others to engage in these kind of violent attacks against other minorities and other groups. So this violence, this xenophobic racist violence is something that is becoming more and more normalized in many, many communities.
Yeah, and I know you've seen the recent polls that say that, I don't know, as many as 60% of some Americans believe, or I guess Republicans believe, that violence is okay. Is that number shocking to you again?
No, because if you think that the existing system is biased and it's basically hijacked by your political rivals, why should you support it? If everybody tells you day and night that democracy is corrupted and the democratic process is not really a reflection of the people's will, why should you support it? And they are being fed for 4 years with this kind of propaganda. So if you are being fed and brainwashed for 4 years that the democracy is being hijacked, why should you support democracy?
Yeah, let me make
that's how they get to the point where they're saying, yes, violence is justified.
Yeah, the poll I actually saw said that 40% of Republicans, not 60%, but it also had this startling statistic that 41% of independents. So I wonder, are these independents just, Republicans dressed up as independents? Because that's a shockingly high number for, groups that consider themselves independents.
No, I think that there's definitely on the right side, but in general, I think there's more Americans who are willing to use violence against political rivals. And again, it's mostly on the right side of the political spectrum, but we also see growing numbers also in the center and the left who are also saying, if we need to defend democracy, violence is justified. And I think this increased polarizations and really the dehumanization and the delegitimizations of political rivals leads to this kind of horrible consequences where there's no really place for consensus building, for an actual conciliation process, and things are really escalating. And I think it's really important to remember that eventually the only alternative to actual concessions and conciliatory process is violence, and that's what we see right now.
For a long time, though, Americans thought extremists were, the Hamas and the Islamic State. We didn't hear much about homegrown terrorist groups until, these last 4 or 5 years. Where were these groups?
They were always here. It was just very comfortable for us to utilize the term terrorism to describe foreign threats. We used other names to describe ideological violence inside. We used the word hate crimes, we used bias crimes, but the fact is that these are crimes that are motivated by political ideology. They are aimed to terrorize entire communities, right? So when someone attacks a minority or an African American or Hispanic, whoever, they want to send a message to their wider community that they do not belong, that they're not welcome in this country, or any other political message. So these are acts that fit a lot of the criteria that we usually use to describe terrorism. They attack against the use of violence to send a political message and to terrorize a wider community. And the fact that we felt comfortable not to term that terrorism was something which was very comfortable to the great majority of Americans, with the understanding that we are not that unique, that a lot of the phenomena that we see in other countries also we see here, I think allowed us to start using this term also here in the US. I'll just say that there's still no federal criminal statute for domestic terrorism. There is a definition in the Patriot Act, which can be used for investigative procedures, but we really don't have any federal statute. We don't have any domestic list of terrorist organizations. So we are still have limited tools. And by the way, I think today in Politico, you've seen a piece where basically most of the prosecutors of the January 6th of January 6 events didn't use even didn't use any kind of terrorism-related offenses when they were suing or prosecuting the participants of the insurrection.
Do you think those prosecutions are having any impact in terms of weakening the power of these, extremist groups?
I think they push some of those groups to be more conscious about their internal security and going more underground. But the fact is that not really. I think that they just learned that, they just need to be smarter in the way they operate, in the way they utilize their organizations and their violence. And overall, the punishments, except for some outliers, the punishments were not that significant. Look, a criminal record can be devastating for regular citizens. But the fact is that these groups enjoy mass support in their ideological roots, and overall, the long-term impact of the prosecutions, I think, will be very limited. I don't think that people will stop joining militias just because some protesters in DC were prosecuted and got some fines or some parole time or something like that.
So what is it going to take to break the backs of these right-wing extremist groups?
So I think the solution is something that we can see easily implemented in other democracies. In places like the UK and Germany, there's much more severe sanctions for using organizations in order to undermine democratic processes, in order to subvert the democratic institutions. And those countries are not shy of basically disbanding organizations that are clearly racist, are clearly calling for violence against the government. I do believe that the government have the right to protect itself, and the people have the right to protect themselves. So I think this is one thing. And I'm not talking about freedom of speech. Freedom of speech needs to be maintained, but organizations that in their mission statement declaring that they want to end American democracy or they have racist goals and so on, there's no reason why we cannot act against them. The second thing that we need to do, I think, is being much more conscious about giving prosecutors more tools to go after those organizations and those members. And finally, we should empower citizens who are being harmed to file civil suits. As many civil suits as possible. Many of those organizations in the past collapsed because they couldn't sustain the damages that they had to pay for civil suits. So everyone who is a victim of a hate crime should look for justice. Let's use more our civil suits procedures to go after those people.
And finally, Professor, we're sitting here a year later after January 6th, not much concern that today there's going to be the kind of attack we saw a year ago. But do you think another January 6th is possible? The kind of vicious attack that we saw, is that possible? Can that happen again?
I think not in DC. I think DC is now protected, but I definitely think that other institutions on the state level, in local levels, we're definitely going to see, it's very likely that we'll see attempts for violence against local politicians, local institutions, because again, most of those militias, most of the organizations have mostly local organizations, local associations. And I think this is where they feel more comfortable to operate, and it's where it's more difficult to target those organizations. So they don't need to come to DC in order to put a bomb in a Capitol building. They can do it in any of the Capitol building in all the 50 states. So I think we really need to look at the local level rather than just focusing on what's going on in DC.
I said that was the last question, but I do have this question for you. The committee, the January 6th committee, congressional committee, do you think they've made any positive headway? And are you hopeful that by having trials, hearings at least, that'll be publicized, that the entire nation can watch, that will have some positive impact on lessening the power of these groups?
I would like to say yes. I would like to say that they really exposed a lot of the dynamics that led to January 6th. They exposed the responsibility of a lot of decision makers and politicians that didn't do enough to prevent it. However, our society is so polarized And the way people observe information and news is so biased these days that my concern is that regardless of what kind of a final product they'll produce, people will basically just incorporate that to their existing political views and just won't, so I would like to say yes, I'm a bit skeptic, but I do think that it's really important that this committee exists, and I think it's really important that people are accountable for what they did and during January 6th. So I really want to, to commend not just the congressmen on the committee, but actually all the dozens of workers behind the scenes who do a great job in collecting documents, in interviewing participants and so on, and collecting so much information that will help us to better understand in the next few years what really happened.
Thank you so much for sitting down with me this morning. We're out of time, but again, Dr. Ari Perliger's book is The American Zealots Inside Right-Wing Domestic Terrorism. Appreciate you helping us understand and make sense of this horrific anniversary. I hate to call it an anniversary because that usually conjures up something positive, but we are 1 year after that attack on our nation's capital.
Thank you for having me, and Happy New Year for everyone.
Thank you. Well, I want to thank the professor and thank my other guests on the show this morning for helping us just gain some insights into what happened on January 6th. The president has given a speech. The vice president gave a speech this morning. We know there's going to be a prayer vigil. People around the nation are going to be remembering those that lost their lives. We heard Dr. Carter say we don't talk enough about the trauma that members or individuals that live in the District of Columbia experienced on that day. We also can't talk enough about the police officers, the brave officers that lost their lives that day as well. It's really important that we remember them who died as a result of the horrific actions that we all saw play out on January 6th. This is not an anniversary. This is a wake-up call. This is a wake-up call for all of us that care about our country, that care about our democracy. As you've heard the guest this morning say, pretty much everything is on the line. Our democracy is on the line. And I'm going to leave you with words to live by. I think what Dr. Carter said was so profound. She said, this is the time for all of us to be honest with ourselves. And I'll say to be honest about what kind of country do we want to live in, and who do we want to be our neighbors? Do we really want to have to fear that our next door neighbor, our lawyer, our accountant, the local, owner of the store where we buy our groceries might be someone who has bought into the lie, that is willing to embrace violence to protect the lie? I don't know if Dr. Keyssar's advice of each of us talking to, our fellow neighbor, coworker, colleague is the answer, since it's pretty clear that logic doesn't work when people are acting from a place of emotion, when people have been radicalized by the rhetoric that they've, are exposed to on a daily basis. But clearly, something has to happen. And this is a battle for the soul of our nation. But I think that we, the folks who are on the right side, the folks who know that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are legitimately elected president and vice president of this country, I think we're going to win this battle. I'm out. Y'all be safe out there. Wear your mask, get your booster, and remember, we're all in this together.